Picture this. It's 1991. One of the world's only two superpowers, a nuclear-armed empire stretching across 11 time zones. It just vanished. Poof. Gone. Now, something that massive doesn't happen overnight. It was the final move in a long, complicated game that completely redrew the map of the world. So that's the big question, right? How does a global superpower just fall apart? Was it pushed from the outside, or did it just rot from the inside? Well, that's what we're going to dig into. And to find the answer, we first have to understand the two clashing worlds that defined that whole era. Okay, so let's set the stage. The Cold War was, at its heart, this huge ideological battle between two totally opposite ways of seeing the world. On one side, you had the communist bloc. Think one-party rule, where any kind of dissent was crushed. But the state guaranteed you certain social and economic rights, like a job and a place to live. On the other side, you had the West's liberal democracies, which were all about civil and political rights, like freedom of speech and the right to protest. These two systems just could not coexist peacefully forever. To really get your head around the collapse, a lot of historians use this brilliant metaphor. The USSR was like a house of cards. From the outside, it looked massive, imposing, unbeatable. But its foundation, it was incredibly unstable. So let's start by looking at the cracks that were forming from the inside. And what's really helpful is how our source material breaks all this down. It actually splits the causes into three buckets: domestic factors, external pressures, and the role of key people. So following that roadmap, let's kick things off with the problems at home. I mean, the Soviet system was just riddled with these deep fundamental flaws. The whole state-controlled economy was wildly inefficient, which led to stagnation, nothing new was being made, and there were shortages of basic goods. You had this enormous, corrupt bureaucracy that was just a leaky bucket for money and resources. On top of that, it was a multi-ethnic empire where tons of people felt totally dominated by Russia. And bubbling under all of that was just this constant, heavy feeling of repression. The system just wasn't working for its people anymore. And all that leads to this concept our source calls the pressure cooker syndrome. Think about it. Decades of autocratic rule had created this huge amount of resentment just simmering below the surface. People felt stuck, but they also had this deep-seated belief that if someone just lifted the lid on that pressure cooker, society could and would bounce back. All that pressure was just waiting for a release valve. Okay, so you've got your house of cards, and its foundation is all cracked and unstable. Now imagine a huge wind starts to blow. That's what the external pressures were like, these massive outside forces that started to push on the whole fragile Soviet system. For starters, the USSR was locked in this insanely expensive arms race with the United States, something its sputtering economy could barely handle. Then President Reagan announced his Star Wars initiative, this high-tech missile defense system that basically threatened to make the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal useless. You had a draining 10-year-long war in Afghanistan to the mix, plus the growing global idea of human rights, and the pressure was just becoming unbearable. And we really, really cannot overstate the impact of that war in Afghanistan. The sources flat out call it a death blow for the USSR. It was their Vietnam, a bloody, costly, demoralizing mess that just sucked the life out of the Soviet military and economy. It's not called the graveyard of empires for nothing. And here's where things get really interesting, showing how even a piece of paper can be a weapon. Back in 1975, the Soviet bloc signed something called the Helsinki Accords. Now, they got what they wanted, official recognition of Europe's post-war borders. But in return, they had to officially promise to protect human rights. This was a huge deal. It gave protesters and dissidents inside the Soviet Union an official document they could point to and say, hey, you promised. It gave their struggle a whole new level of legitimacy. So the house of cards is groaning, the wind is howling, and then one man walks up to the table. And he gives it a push, not because he wants to knock it all down, but because he wants to try and fix it. That man was Mikhail Gorbachev, and his reforms would turn out to be the final, accidental push that brought the whole thing down. Now, this is the most crucial point to understand about Gorbachev. He didn't create these problems. He inherited a total mess. By the time he took power in 1985, the source material is crystal clear that the Soviet Union was already on life support. His goal was to reform it, to save it from itself. But the system was just too broken. So he rolled out two massive new policies. First was glasnost, which means openness. For the first time, people had freedom of the press, they could talk about problems, and even make democratic reforms. Then came perestroika, or restructuring, which was his attempt to bring in some market-style economic changes. He basically walked over that pressure cooker, and he opened the valve. And maybe his single most important decision was in foreign policy. He got rid of the old Soviet rule that said they'd use force to keep their Eastern European satellite states in line. He replaced it with something they cheekily called the Sinatra Doctrine. Yep, as in Frank Sinatra. He basically told all those countries, you can do it my way. For the first time in decades, the nations of the Warsaw Pact were actually free to choose their own futures. And what happened next was, well, exactly what you'd expect. It was immediate, and it was unstoppable. The source notes put it perfectly. Once central control was relaxed, communism started collapsing like a house of cards. That gentle push to fix things had started a chain reaction that no one could stop. And the year 1989 was just a blur, a total snowball effect. First, in June, Poland's Solidarity movement wins a free election. Then, in October, Hungary literally opens its border, punching a massive hole in the Iron Curtain. And then the big one. In November, the Berlin Wall falls. After that, it's just dominoes. Czechoslovakia's peaceful Velvet Revolution, the violent overthrow of the dictator in Romania. In about 6 months, Soviet control over all of Eastern Europe had just evaporated. So the collapse is complete. But the story doesn't stop there. The question of who actually won the Cold War, if anyone did, is still a huge point of debate. And that brings us to the last part of our story.
And wow, the perspectives could not be more different. From the American point of view, it was a clear victory. We defeated Russia. The US was the undisputed champion. But from the Russian perspective, absolutely not. No one won. It's seen as a national catastrophe, a self-inflicted wound, and a defeat that, to this day, many in power refuse to accept. But it's fascinating to hear what Gorbachev himself envisioned. In 1989, right as the wall was about to come down, he stood up at the United Nations and declared the Cold War over. He didn't talk about winners and losers. He called for a new world order, one based on multiculturalism, tolerance, and respect, a world where different countries could just live and let live.
Which leaves us with that final, massive question. Was the end of the Cold War an American victory, the result of decades of relentless external pressure? Or was it just the inevitable internal collapse of a broken and unsustainable system that was just given one final nudge? The real answer, as it usually is probably somewhere in the middle. And it's something historians are going to be debating for a long, long time.